Along with everything else that's been going on, Tim has been continuing to work very hard to represent taxpayers when it comes to the top slicing relief calculations and the various conversations he's been having with the revenue. I was about to say we've now reached the end of this particular story, but as Tim will explain, we haven't quite got to the end. But Tim, let's start by saying that on budget day, we were told that the revenue's opinion had changed on top slicing, but only from budget day onwards.
Yes, that budget day announcement came out of the blue and was quite a surprise. I and Keith Gordon had been working towards the upper tribunal hearing that was scheduled for 31st of March, and that was to hear HMRC's appeal against the first tier tribunal judgment in favour of Marina Silva. Just to remind viewers, Marina Silva had cashed in a single premium non-qualifying life policy for about 110,000, and the tax calculated by HMRC was nearly £20,000 more than it would have been if they'd used the top slicing calculation that I suggested. And Neville Silva, her husband, had taken the case entirely on his own to the first tier tribunal. I wasn't involved in that. But after the judgment in their favour, HMRC refunded 19,000 or so, but they also appealed against that judgment. And as I say, the hearing was due on 31st of March. Well, I'd agreed to help Neville Silva and his wife through that process. They're both well into their 80s, by the way. And I instructed Keith Gordon of council to take the case to the upper tribunal. So we were getting ready for it, had prepared our skeleton argument, made various submissions, put together the bundle, and out of the blue on the 11th of March, the budget press releases included the changes to take effect, but only from 11th of March. And there were two changes in particular, which we'll cover in detail in our budget special. But I was then even more surprised when on Friday the 13th of March, 2 days after the budget, I received an email from HMRC's Solicitor's Office and Legal Services, SOLS, and the Revenue Solicitor invited us to agree a consent order that he had drafted for presentation to the upper tribunal, and that consent order would have consented to HMRC's withdrawal of their appeal. And I expect that the Revenue Solicitor was anticipating that we would simply agree to consent to the withdrawal of their appeal, but we didn't. And there's a very important reason as to why we didn't. There are one or two ancillary reasons, but the primary one was a concern that HMRC were doing what they have done on previous occasions, which was to withdraw from appealing a first-tier tribunal decision against them because they reckoned that they had a poor chance of winning their appeal and would rather, in fact, have the first-tier tribunal judgment against them stand and not have it confirmed in the upper tribunal. And as many of our viewers will know, the reason for that is that first-tier tribunal judgments are of persuasive value only. They are not binding on any other tribunal or court decisions. Whereas had there been an upper tribunal decision against HMRC, which we had anticipated, and clearly so too had the Revenue, that judgment would have been binding and would then have opened the floodgates for claimants in a similar position to the Silvers going back a number of years. And so I was concerned that the withdrawal by consent would leave the Revenue in that position, and so resisted and did not agree to it. But then on the 17th of March at exactly 5 p.m, which is relevant because that was the last minute by which HMRC were required to deliver their skeleton argument to us. They didn't deliver a skeleton argument. Instead, they unilaterally applied to the tribunal to withdraw their appeal. And the following day, the tribunal judge, Judge Richards, did, and I can understand why, consent and order that the appeal be withdrawn. Well, he didn't order that the appeal would be withdrawn. That would be slightly the wrong way of putting it. He accepted their withdrawal, let's put it like that, and agreed that they should pay reasonable costs of the taxpayer. Had the judge ordered that the case be dismissed, then I think that could have given us more of a binding precedent, as it were. But anyway, these are legal niceties. The main point is that the first tier tribunal judgment has not been overturned, and so Judge Mosedale's interpretation of the top slicing relief calculation, which is 100% in line with mine, that is now the interpretation of the law. And I would encourage anybody with clients who have had top slicing calculations which resulted in significant additional amounts of tax being paid to have a look at it and consider now putting in overpayment relief claims or claims under extra statutory concession B41. As I've pointed out in Taxation Magazine and elsewhere, HMRC are resisting overpayment relief claims on the grounds of practice generally prevailing. I think they're going to have some difficulty in sustaining that, but it might need another tribunal hearing. And the extra statutory concession issue hasn't yet been addressed. But there are tens of thousands of pounds at stake for individual taxpayers, and I would strongly recommend that those agents who have clients with chargeable event gains in the last few years do now pursue those claims so that their clients end up having paid the right amount of tax rather than having been overcharged.
Okay, and so we know that from the 11th of March onwards, the law is what you have always said effectively, but as you say, we'll talk about that in more detail in the budget special. But looking backwards at cases that are, about situations that have already happened, tax years that have already passed, the answer is that because we don't have precedent, it isn't that it's become effectively the law, but it is the best we've got. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think it is the law. It is a question of the correct interpretation of the law. HMRC have incorrectly interpreted the law in the past, in my view, in the view of many others, and in the view of Judge Mosedale in the first tier tribunal. And HMRC have failed to have that first tier tribunal judgment overturned. Now, I think this would make it very, very difficult for them to resist other claims, but we have to wait to see exactly what the revenue response will be. It's also noteworthy in this context that the words and phrases used in the budget releases on the 11th of March include phrases like "for the avoidance of doubt" and "clarification" and "original intention of Parliament," all of which supports the contention that the change has been made to ensure that the legislation does what I and others have said it has done all along. So it's not quite that simple, and it may well be I'm being unduly cautious here, and the revenue will simply welcome claims with open arms. But I suspect that's not the case, and that agents and taxpayers will have to push quite hard to get their refunds. But what the revenue will no longer be able to do is write back to claimants and their agents saying, in our view, the HMRC interpretation remains correct and the silver case is under appeal. They can't do that because they've withdrawn their appeal.
And in terms of the last 4 years, if you were looking backwards, then presumably we would be able to act now without a problem. It's only if it's before that we would have this practice generally prevailing issue.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think there is clarity in respect of the 4 years covered by the overpayment relief legislation, because there's the well-known rider which allows HMRC to refuse an overpayment relief claim if the tax that was paid at the time, or the return that was made at the time, was on the basis of practice generally prevailing. And so there will have to be this further argument as to whether or not over the last 4 years, the revenue's incorrect interpretation did indeed count as practice generally prevailing. Certainly, it cannot do that from the date of the silver judgment, which was February, well, the judgment was delivered April 19, I would say, going back to my article in Taxation in September 17, which raised the point in detail, the revenue can not claim that the practice was prevailing in the sense that everybody agreed it. And in fact, there were earlier articles. Richard Curtis of Taxation magazine in particular had written articles well before 2016. So I think the revenue will have a bit of a battle on their hands, but I'm not able to say categorically that overpayment relief claims will at the moment succeed. If they're outwith the time limit for overpayment relief, we then fall back on an extra statutory concession where, curiously, I think we may have more chance of success because the concession B41 provides that where you're outwith the 4-year time limit, if the overpayment arose as a result of revenue error, which clearly it has done, the revenue interpreted the law incorrectly, and the facts are not in doubt or dispute, which there won't be, the repayment should be made. So if we're going back to, say, 2013-14, which is out with the overpayment relief claim, I would say make a claim under extra statutory concession B41.
Okay, so there are various ways and means of achieving these goals for people. Worth noting that in the press releases that were announced on Budget Day, the revenue had to confirm exactly how much this was likely to cost them. I like to say it the other way around, the amount that the revenue had been overcharging taxpayers over the years. And I think it's fair to say that your work has saved the UK taxpayer around £15 million a year.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I'm purely concerned with getting it right. And actually, I've no wish, particularly at this time, to deprive the Exchequer of a single penny. And I'm equally vehement, if you like, about getting HMRC to change their calculator when they are undercharging, as I am when they are overcharging. And on several occasions in the past 3 or 4 years, I've emailed the software development team at HMRC and pointed out occasions on which their calculator is being too generous. One of those happens to be the way in which they work out the notional tax credit on chargeable event gains. They are too generous on that in some cases, and I tell them that. So it swings and roundabouts, but I'm simply concerned that the tax legislation is correctly interpreted, and that's what this is all about for me.
At the end of the day, all about paying the right amount of tax. Now it's time for Admin Minute.